Forest conservation has historically been looked at as the state's responsibility. It's been assumed that only the state can possibly manage and conserve such a vast area of land. In this debate, forest dwellers and communities have more often than not been ignored. They're looked at as forest depleters, encroachers, making a living off of forest resources and inevitably causing the demise of our green cover. In this episode of So Basically, we question all these notions and talk about how forest-dwelling communities can conserve our forests effectively. In the Forest Act of 1865, the British government had obliterated centuries-old customary rights of local communities and established exclusive state control over forest resources. Their justification was that under Indian customs, all property held in common, like forests, lakes, etc., belonged to the king. Since the British were the conquerors, that property now belonged to them. Has much changed after independence for communities that inhabit these forests or depend on them for sustenance or livelihood? Who should be the custodian of our forests? Foresters, agents of the state, or forest dwellers, the communities that have lived in forests all these centuries? The Indian state, much like its British predecessor, still views forest communities as encroachers without any legitimate claim on forest resources. There is an assumption that the forests can be well protected only if local forest-using communities, considered to be the ones causing forest degradation, are excluded. This assumption, however, is far from reality. Let's look at some numbers. The recorded forest area of the country is 76.52 million hectares, out of which the degraded forest area in the country is as high as 60%. As against this, the total encroachment in forest areas is merely 1.9% of the total forest area. Out of this total encroachment, the area used by the forest dwellers would be even smaller. So do you see how the extent of encroachment is minuscule in the context of degradation of forests and is essentially played up to divert attention from real problems? The noise around the encroachment issue has silenced valid criticisms of the performance of our state foresters in sustaining the forests. The first attempt to create legal mechanisms to assert and safeguard state control over forests was made through the Indian Forest Act of 1865. This act wiped out the centuries-old customary use of forest resources by rural communities all over India. The same act, with minor modifications in 1927, is still operational in independent India. The fact that independent India continued with this outdated model speaks volumes of the apathy and lack of concern not only for the forest-dwelling communities but also for the forests. The proponents of exclusive state control on forests base their case on the claim of the tragedy of the commons. The idea is that commonly held open access resources like forests and grazing lands inevitably suffer overexploitation, as no individual has an incentive to stop his or her use of the resource as long as others are also able to use this. Communally held open access resources in practice are never free for all, but are controlled by a host of intricate rules and regulations for their use. Before the advent of British control, local communities were actually managing forest resources in sensible and sustainable ways through informal rules and practices. Bringing these resources under state control actually created the tragedy of open access rather than solving it, as local communities lost all incentives to manage forests. The forests no longer belonged to them, and they started acting irresponsibly. The first policy advocating local communities' claims on forests is the National Forest Policy of 1998. It emphasized safeguarding the customary rights and interests of tribal people and forest-dwelling communities. It is beyond doubt that community ownership and management of forests through well-defined and enforceable property rights is the best way. It solves two problems simultaneously. It provides for the protection of forests and for dignified livelihood to the poorest communities in the country. So basically, the most efficient as well as the moral resolution is to take our forests from the foresters and put them in the hands of forest dwellers. For more information, please visit spontaneousorder.in, and as always, like, share and subscribe.